Hey guys, it's Alex, and I'm here with this week's review, which is The Thief by Whalen Turner. This is a middle grade fantasy novel about a thief named Jin who's arrested and sent to prison, and then one of the king's closest aides comes to him with a job. If Jin steals a mysterious object for him, they will set Jin free. That mysterious object is called the gift, which comes from the gods, and whoever has the gift is considered to be the chosen leader of the country Edis. The king of Sunis and the queen of Atolia both want the gift so that they can be the rulers of Edis. The book follows Jin, as well as the king's aide and two of his apprentices, on the journey as they try to steal the gift. I'm filming these reviews vastly out of order. I still have a stack of about 6 books on my shelf from October that I need to film, but I picked this book, which I read at just the end of November, because I knew that if I waited any longer to review this book, I would completely forget everything about it. Even just in describing it, I had to go through the book to check for the names of the countries and the names of the people, because I really don't remember much. And I think that's indicative of how I felt about this book overall. I gave it 3 stars, and honestly, it's already fading from memory. And I'm only filming this about a week and a half or 2 weeks after I finished reading it. I buddy read this with cozy reader Kelly, and I think we both sort of agreed that this book was very boring. This felt like the introduction to a story rather than a story itself. It felt like the book lacked an arc. Most of it was about the traveling to steal the gift. There was a lot of traveling in this book. There was a lot of complaining about bad food and talking about the inns they stayed at and where they made camp and their fencing lessons. And honestly, a lot of things that I really didn't care about in the slightest. This felt like it needed to be condensed down into the first third of the next book in the series. Because this is a series, and this is definitely setting up this series as a whole. It felt like the story was going to be interesting. It felt like the world they were setting up and the story and the characters were all going to be very interesting to read about and very worthwhile, perhaps. But this book alone isn't. There isn't enough story in it. There really wasn't much of an arc at all until the last few chapters of the book. And I honestly really enjoyed the last few chapters of the book. I thought they were interesting. I cared. I was invested. But I wasn't invested in the first 85%, and that was this book's problem. I did give it 3 stars because of that, because by the time I got to the end, I wanted to continue the series. And that was my plan, to continue the series, until I checked my library and realized that my library doesn't actually have the rest of the series. So this book is honestly going straight into the unhaul pile for me, and I'm really annoyed. Not that my library doesn't have it, but that made this book feel like an even bigger waste of time. I didn't mind it so much once I got to the end because I was like, okay, this is interesting. This might be worth it if I continue on with the rest of the series. But because I don't get to continue on with the rest of the series, this book was completely worthless, and that sort of makes me regret giving it 3 stars for being interesting at the end, because now I just feel bitter. I think if you go into this book, you have to commit to reading not only this one, but also the second in the series. I don't know if the second one gets any better, but I do know that on its own, this book is not worth it. It's meandering and boring and utterly pointless. There really isn't much of a plot. It's just introducing you to the characters. This is who these people are. This is Sophos. This is the king's aide. This is Jin. Here they are. Here are the 3 countries. Here's what the war is. Here are who the gods are. And all of that is fine, but it needs to be woven into a story with an arc. I need to follow something, not just learn all these facts about this world. If you're going to do that, just give me a world building worksheet and let me read that for a few pages instead of an entire book. There were sections in this that were just literal stories about the gods. The king's aide would just tell a story about the gods to his apprentices, and there'd just be several pages that was literally just, here's how the earth and the moon fell in love, here's how they fought over the rivers and the people. And it was boring. I don't mind reading about myths, but there were a number of them in here, and I really didn't care. It felt like that could have been woven into the story better. It felt like there could have been a story for that to be a part of. That just sort of felt like oh, I need to tell you this information about the world. Here's an easy and lazy way to do it. And I didn't care. I had to work very hard not to just skim through those sections of the story because they were kind of important to the world. Like, it is good to understand that stuff. It's just when it's in a story, just told flat out like that, and it's not part of the actual story arc or character arcs, it's boring. One thing that I did find very interesting about this book was that it's a Greek-inspired fantasy book, and I don't think I've ever read any of those. Obviously, there are a lot of actual Greek fantasy books that are literally taking the Greek gods and putting them into a fantasy book the author has created. Percy Jackson, for one. But I've never read a book that was just inspired by that, where the author created her own world and her own gods that was inspired by the Greek mythology. And I thought that was very interesting. I thought the research she did into Greek mythology and the way she wove that into her own world was really well done and really interesting. And that was honestly one of the things I was most looking forward to. Because it wasn't just the mythology, it was the Greek culture itself and the countries and the way they interacted with each other. I really enjoyed that. One thing that was kind of difficult for me in this book, and I don't know if it was because I was bored and not paying that close of attention, but there were scenes where I would be confused about what was going on. Like something would happen and I didn't understand why it was happening, and I felt like I was missing a few sentences to explain what was going on. At one point, food goes missing, and the king's aide beats Jin for stealing the food. But it had never been mentioned before, and there was never like any like, oh no, what happened to the food? It was just randomly, they got mad, said the food was gone, and started hitting Jin. And I really was confused about that. I didn't understand why that was happening, and I wound up reading that section 3 times, like looking for more information on it. And I always felt like there were a number of scenes like that where I was just a little bit lost. Like, she knew what she was writing, and it made sense in her head, but as a reader and not being in her head and seeing the whole picture, I felt like I was very much missing something. And there were a number of occasions where I had to go back and like reread things because I worried that I was missing something. And I came away feeling just as confused. Also, in that regard, I did have trouble keeping up with all the different kings and queens and countries. I got them very mixed up, and even now I had to go through and skim through the pages to remember what the countries were and like who the people were, because it felt like there was a lot being introduced and not much of a story for me to make sense of them, which is the way I sort of function in books. I learn about countries and who they are because of the way they function in a story. And this felt more like a straight introduction of everything rather than a story where all the pieces work together. I think at times the writing could be a little bit heavy-handed in that stereotypical high fantasy way. Like, for example, when the boys were warming up before they practiced their fencing, she wouldn't use the word stretching. She'd say they were moving and dancing and bending in preparation for the sword fight. And it's like one of those situations where I get this is high fantasy, you can just use the word stretching. That's fine, we'll believe it. Like, it felt like she was working very hard within the writing to give this a very high fantasy feel. And it did feel kind of like heavy-handed, and I did roll my eyes a little bit. It just seemed a little bit unnecessary and over the top for me. I didn't particularly care that much, and it was just overall it seemed a little bit unnecessary. Not really bad, just one of those things. It's like a minor annoyance, but I continued on and it was fine. Overall, I do have trouble recommending this book. It might be worth it if you continue on with the series and enjoy the later books in the series, but I can't say for sure because I haven't read them and I'm not going to read them. This book alone is not worth it. There's really not enough story here for me to care. And it is middle grade, but even middle grade books have interesting stories. That's the point. They're not boring, plotless books to introduce characters. Just because the story's meant for 10-year-olds doesn't mean it needs to be somehow a lesser story. 10-year-olds can read a story and follow along perfectly fine. Like, there are plenty of really well done middle grade books out there, and this really wasn't one of them. It was just kind of disappointing and mediocre at best, and incredibly boring. If you like the rest of the series, I can understand that. It was definitely going in a way where it seemed like the rest of the series might be very worth it and interesting. But this book alone, not so much. Let me know down below if you've read this book and what you thought of it if you did. I know this is a somewhat older middle grade book and kind of beloved. I know a lot of people who read this as kids and really loved it, but I just didn't see it. Maybe the rest of the series is really good, but this book alone, I can't really recommend. As always, thank you so much for watching, and I will see you guys again soon.